Hello. In this micro lecture, we're going to talk about how to develop a search pattern in 5 easy steps. Step 1. One of the most important things that you can do when you are reviewing studies and developing a search pattern is to make sure that you are reviewing the correct study. It is particularly challenging in the modern era of PACS to not get confused that the study you are actually looking at might be an old study. Make sure that your hanging protocols are set up appropriately so that you have your new study in the same location every time you look at an examination. For instance, if you are reading chest x-rays and by convention you have the new study on the left screen and the old study on the right screen, make sure that your hanging protocol is set up that way, but also ensure that you check the dates and times of each study so that you don't inadvertently interpret the wrong study, assuming that the hanging protocol has gotten it correct. Step 2. Make sure that before you try to set up a search pattern, you are familiar with all of the relevant anatomy on that type of imaging study before you start to develop your patterns. For instance, if you are reading cross-sectional imaging of the abdomen, make sure that you are familiar with all of the anatomic segments of the liver, what the gallbladder looks like, what the normal splenic anatomy is, vascular anatomy, before you start to create your search pattern. Once you create your search pattern, it is much harder to go back and recognize that you are not as familiar or comfortable with the anatomy as you thought you were. Step 3, pick a pattern. But once you pick a pattern, you must stick to it. Do not vary from your pattern once you have it established. That is a surefire way to exclude things accidentally from your routine. It is okay to add things to your pattern as you start to recognize blind spots, but do not change your basic search pattern once you have established it and become comfortable. Step 4 is about the search pattern. Everyone has a different search pattern. Just because I use one particular one doesn't mean that it will work for you. Everyone has their own way of looking at things. Particularly true for individuals who learned how to read cases on film before PACS systems came into play. There are a variety of ways that you can use these search patterns. You can choose to do it by location. For instance, you might choose to look at a chest x-ray from the middle of the film out towards the periphery. So for instance, you would start with cardiac and mediastinal silhouettes and then move out peripherally to look at the lungs and then to look at the bony structures and the soft tissues. You might look at it in an organ system approach. For instance, when I read an abdominal CT, I prefer to look at it by reviewing all of the liver anatomy. Then I move to the gallbladder, then the spleen, then the pancreas, then I look at the adrenal glands, then the kidneys, the bladder, the reproductive organs, and the bowel. And then I go back and look at the bones and the lung windows. That works for me, but it may not work for you, but that is my system. You may choose, if you're looking at a study like an MRI of the abdomen, which has multiple sequences, you can look at it in a sequence-based format where you look at each sequence independent of each other so that you would review all of the organ systems on your T1 weighted images, and then you would look at your T2 weighted images and look at all of your organ systems. Or you may choose to look at a single organ over multiple sequences. For instance, you would look at the liver on the T1 and then immediately look at the liver on the T2 weighted images, and then look at the liver on the diffusion weighted images. That's fine. Whatever works for you, just remember, stick to your sequence and your pattern once you have established it. Step 5, the final step. It is okay to add things to your search pattern over time. You will start to recognize areas that are blind spots for you over time, and that is totally normal. What you should do is add those blind spots to the end of your search pattern so that you make sure that you are still looking for them, but it does not interfere with what you have established as your baseline search pattern. And this avoids you missing things in your search pattern because you have now stepped outside of what you are familiar with. So remember, add things as you go over the course of your career which have become blind spots for you, but add them to the end of your search pattern. And with that, I will summarize that you should have a 5-step approach to reviewing and establishing a search pattern as you go along. We talked about making sure that you are looking at the appropriate study, make sure that you are familiar with the anatomy before you start to establish your search pattern, create a search pattern, and always stick to it. Do not vary it. Recognize that there are differences in search pattern depending on individual and the study itself, and add to your pattern as you go through your career. Thank you.